Thank you to Frederick, Dustin, Chris, and Tyler for making this Necron Codex review possible. When biotransference comes for you, we'll make sure you get the good war scythes. Hi everyone, welcome back for another Codex review here with your Nemesor Scottrekh. We're going to be talking about the Necron Codex today. I've been pretty excited to talk about this book, and I'm sure most of you are not, because you're probably annoyed with local Necron players and how they've been treating you lately with their stupid busted book. It has been, I guess, about 2 months now, coming up on 2 months, since the book dropped. So we have had it long enough that the most obviously busted stuff has had a nerf or two. However, I know the data slate just came out, and it did not bring any changes for Necrons or AdMech, who launched at the same time. Presumably, GW feels like they still need more time to, I don't know, figure out what to do with those books. Nonetheless, Necrons have had a fairly good couple months in the win rate column. We have seen a couple of different detachments have success as well, which is a good thing, even as the win rates themselves are something that probably should come down. Unfortunately, AdMech have been on the other side of that dichotomy. We will be covering the AdMech book pretty soon here, actually. I'll be having a seasoned 10th edition AdMech player join me so we can talk over them. But you'll have to wait probably until next month for that one. But today we are going to talk about the Necrons. As with our other Codex reviews, I will be basically just kind of covering the Necron detachments, of which they have 5. I want to talk a little bit about them, what makes them good, what makes them bad, what maybe is some room in the near future, or I guess probably about 3 months from now, when the next data slate drops, that they might see some improvement or some nerfing within those detachments. What you should expect to see on the table, what some cool stuff that you might be able to play with on the table is, what I love, what I don't. And then we'll maybe just talk a little bit about some of the combos that work best in this book. Now that we've had, like I said, about 2 months that we've been able to kind of see them on the table and see how they play out. I am going to be starting with some of the less heralded detachments, and then we'll kind of work our way towards a couple of the more useful ones towards the end here. Like I said, thankfully the cool thing about Necrons is that there are multiple detachments that can have some success, and I actually, as I will get to, I think that there's definitely still some room for exploration in this book. The Necron book is not as bonkers as, say, like Eldar at the start of 10th were, so I don't think that there is necessarily an unlimited amount of good builds in here that are just being obscured by better builds. But I do think that, especially as we go through the next couple months and Necrons inevitably do get some nerfs, which they undoubtedly deserve, there are some other kind of tools in this book that players can lean into a little bit and experiment with and play with to still find success in their games and still have fun in their games. But right now, of course, we are in an unnerfed Necron meta, so there are going to be a couple units that are going to stand out way more than others in almost every build that you're going to see. But like I said, we're going to start with a couple of the weaker detachments, or at least win rate wise weaker detachments, and we're going to talk a little bit about them because, for one, Necrons, the cool thing about their detachments is that they do genuinely mostly push you towards a different archetype than the other detachments, and that is an awesome thing because it means that you can actually have some variability in lists. But even though these two detachments that I'm going to kind of reference here are not necessarily doing great right now and don't seem super competitively viable. They could, with like probably relatively minor changes, become something that actually has play. Or I should say, at least one of them does. The other one needs a little bit more work, but we'll kind of see how it plays out, I guess, in the future. We're going to start with the Annihilation Legion. That is the destroyer-specific detachment for the Necron book. The Annihilation Legion really, and this is going to be an ongoing theme with this book, with the Necron book. Its primary issue, I think, actually lands a little bit in the keywords front. Namely, the Annihilation Legion obviously should focus on destroyer units. It also throws flayed ones in kind of with them. But that's problematic because it doesn't give you enough units to play with when you're looking at the toys that you get from the enhancements and the stratagems. It actually doubles down even a little bit on this because despite the fact that using the destroyer keyword plus flayed ones actually should give you about 4 units to work with, Scottrekh destroyers, Ophidian destroyers, and then the Locust and heavy Locust destroyers, and then again also flayed ones. Pretty much everything in this detachment is tilted towards the melee side of things, and that means that you have these units that are ostensibly quite good, Locust destroyers and their heavy destroyers, that don't really get as much out of this as they probably could, and that's kind of the spot that I would hope that if GW does look at making some adjustments to this detachment in the near future, that is where I would like them to lean, because realistically, like, the benefits to melee units in this detachment are pretty good. The issue is kind of just that Ophidian destroyers, whilst a great tech piece, are not necessarily a great melee unit anyway. Scottrekhs are, but they have their own limitations. Namely, I think they could probably do with a little bit of a points cut, or some way, maybe even within this detachment to speed them up a little bit. And flayed ones, whilst they're great, are of course also quite fragile, and you can't really build an army off of them. So you're left with like the units that you're buffing, not necessarily being the type of thing that you can really build something successful out of, which could change very easily if you just were able to throw Locust destroyers into that bunch, and heavy Locust destroyers, and be able to give them some meaningful improvements as well. The detachment rule for Annihilation Legion is that it gives your destroyer units the ability to reroll charges, and also if the target of their charge is under half strength, they get +1 to their charge as well. That's genuinely a good buff for melee units, but again, it only affects melee units, and that means that it's literally just going to be those 2 melee destroyers and flayed ones, who that can't really be your detachment's main gimme. You do get a couple of really interesting enhancements in this detachment, including one which is I don't know if it's unique in 40k right now, but it's got to be pretty close, and it is an outrageously good ability for melee units. The enhancement's called Soulless Reaper. You put it on a destroyer cult model, so that'll be almost certainly a Scottrekh destroyer lord. And what it does is it means that if your opponent ever wants to fall back from the unit that has this enhancement, they have to roll a die, and they can only do it on a 3-up, I think. Sorry, on a 3-up, they cannot fall back. You roll the die. So that's awesome. That's incredibly powerful because of course, the ability that it's mostly a defensive ability to keep your presumably Scottrekh destroyers locked up in a combat where they can then not get blown to hell by opportunistic opponent shooting. This is a really, really strong ability, and it's a very good thing to have for something like Scottrekh destroyers, who actually do hit pretty hard, but are maybe a little vulnerable, especially once they're right in your opponent's face, to getting blown up. That is kind of probably the core combo that you will be leaning into if you're playing this specific detachment. Unfortunately, it's, again, that's not necessarily enough to build an army off of, but what army you do build with this, highly recommended. You also do have one of the less restrictive enhancements or abilities within this legion, or this detachment, is Ingrained Superiority, which can be put on any Necron model, and it just gives that Necron model's unit +1 AP on critical wound rolls. Um, Obviously situational, but the nice thing about this one is that it is for combat, it is for shooting. It can obviously go on any Necrons model, which means that you can get it into a variety of different squads. And AP is, especially in Necrons, actually something that isn't necessarily super available. And so that's a handy little buff to have. There is several versions of fight on death, I should say, not fights first. That would be great, but no fights first in this detachment. But there are a couple of fights on death. There is both an enhancement for fight on death on a 4-up, and then also a stratagem for fight on death on a 4-up, a 1 CP stratagem. I don't know if anybody's kind of realized this trend in 10th edition. If when it comes to stratagems that have fight on death, it'll almost always be 1 CP to roll a die, and on a 4-up you get to fight on death, or 2 CP to guarantee that you get to fight on death. This has the 1 CP version. Which one you prefer is up to you, but they're actually both pretty decent to have. As far as stratagems go, there's some kind of fun ones in here, but again, like there's this intense focus on melee, which doesn't really do the units that you want to take here justice, because you end up having options for Scorpex or maybe flayed ones and nothing else, and that's just not a great road to success. But your stratagems, like I said, there are a bunch. There is a flat and very easily accessible -1 to hit, which you can use on any destroyer or flayed one unit. That's always a wonderful defensive ability. There is a situational but powerful buff called Spore of Frailty that is also 1 CP. Gives you +1 to hit a unit that is below its starting strength, or +1 to hit and wound if they're below their half strength. Again, this is not an uncommon ability in 40k. It is good, but it's tricky because you almost never get the +1 to wound roll, and if you do, you probably have a unit already in a spot where you don't need the +1 to wound. It does give a pretty easy access to a +1 to hit, though, which is nice. You have a stratagem which will increase your pile-in and consolidation range from 3 to 6 inches. Again, this is quite good. However, this particular one is not like, I believe it's the World Eaters one and maybe the Tyranids one, where, if you can't make base with an enemy, you then can use the pile-in and consolidate as a normal move. That is a very powerful ability. This is just good, but not bonkers to increase your pile-in and consolidation range. There will be times where it's absolutely worth it, but it's not like, wow, that's the type of stratagem I want to take this detachment for. And then you also have a stratagem for dealing a few mortals to an enemy unit when they fall back from you. Again, this is actually quite good in an army that is melee focused, because keeping enemies locked in combat is almost certainly something you desperately want to do. So doing some mortal wounds to them, or making them have to worry about having some mortal wounds done to them if they fall back, is a nice deterrent to have. This one also does let you make a normal move after they have fallen back from you. That would be very, very good, except that it can also have the rider that you have to end your move as close to the enemy unit that fell back from you as possible. If it was just a free normal move, this could be very good. It could be a very strong defensive ability for you to be able to kind of try to take your unit from, a exposed position to a more protected one when somebody runs away. As it is, you may still be able to do that, but the fact that you have to end close to the unit that fell back from you means that it's kind of, they can drag you kind of in the direction that they want, and then it may actually end up working against you if you wanted to use this stratagem. And finally, you have a reanimation stratagem, which are common in most of these detachments, to have some sort of way to get an extra reanimation. This is almost certainly the weakest one. You use it after your destroyer unit or flayed one unit has destroyed an enemy unit, or caused that unit that was not below half strength to become below half strength. Those are fine enough, I guess, to deal with as triggers, but the nature of the fact that you've now destroyed an enemy unit probably means that you don't need to reanimate as often. It also can only be used in the fight phase. Again, unnecessary linking of things to melee, where this detachment should probably be more of a combined arms thing. Um, yeah, you compare that to like the Awakened Dynasties reanimate immediately after you've been targeted by some shooting or combat, or even the Canopic Courts reanimating when you're charged. This is just not the best timing for reanimate necessarily, and it has more riders to it, more barriers to its usage than it probably needs to. But it is a reanimate stratagem. It is 1 CP. I don't know if it's if it comes up for you, that's great, but it probably could be better. And that is something, like I said, that comes up a lot with um, this particular detachment. So far, we have not seen GW do extensive rewrites or buffing to particular detachments in the Space Marine or Tyranid book. They more like to play around with points and stuff on units, or maybe make a single minor change to certain detachments. So I can't necessarily hope that this Legion will see its detachment, heavily rewritten. However, if even if some of these abilities were changed so that they could be used in shooting and combat, melee combat, or perhaps if they looked towards some pretty notable cuts to things like Ophidians and Scorpex, maybe that could make this kind of a viable thing. As it is, like I said, there's a lot of good stuff in here, but it's kind of a weird mishmash of things to put together, even as a melee centric detachment. It misses a few of the key abilities that's something you'd see in like World Eaters or CSM or Orcs and stuff. I don't know. It's unfortunate because it probably would be a very fun way to play. And I think that if they can find a way to push um, Locust Destroyers and Heavy Locust Destroyers more into the detachment, you could genuinely see it get play, because those are good units that are really just begging for a few buffs. Um, we'll see. One that's probably a little closer, almost tantalizingly close to some strong playability, is the Obeisance Phalanx. Another detachment that's not getting a ton of play right now. This one, more than even Annihilation Legion, has really just a big issue with keywords. Its detachment ability is just, it functions similar to Oath of Moment. In your command phase, you pick an enemy unit, but instead of getting full rerolls to hit, you just get +1 to wound. +1 to wound is as a blanket ability is awesome. It's you get to pick one unit. You're picking this every command phase. That's great. It's a very good ability. The issue is that the keywords for this detachment, both for this ability and for most of their other abilities, leave you kind of wanting. Specifically, they're kind of the units they're mostly buffing here are going to be Lich Guard, Triarch units, which is going to be both Praetorians and the Walker. What's he called? The Triarch, big scorpion guy. People are going to hate that I don't know the name of it, but I've just never loved the model, even as it was at times pretty good. Triarch Stalker. There you go. It's a Triarch Stalker. And then also anything with an Overlord. Specifically, it uses the Overlord keyword. And the reason for that being problematic is because the Overlord keyword itself is literally only attached to the Overlord datasheets, even though many of the special characters and even some of the non-special characters are ostensibly also Overlords. In this, I am specifically referring to the Catacomb Command Barge, which is just supposed to be an Overlord riding his little chariot. Does not have the Overlord keyword, nor do any of the special characters. It's also probably a decent argument that this detachment, which mostly focuses on like Necron royalty and their specific bodyguards like Lich Guard and Praetorians, probably should mention the Silent King, who is also obviously doesn't have the Overlord keyword. I have seen some people mention that the Overlord keyword should just be subbed for the Noble keyword. That would solve a lot of things. You would still have to carve out a space for the Silent King in here, because he also does not have the Noble keyword. Don't ask me why. But the fact that you are limiting this +1 to wound buff to only Lich Guard, Triarch, and Overlord units really hurts this detachment. And that's kind of like, I don't want to do those units too dirty, because like they actually are all mostly decent units. Praetorians probably don't get the love they deserve. I think that there's definitely room for them to have a little bit more success. in the near future. Probably, especially once we see a few Necron nerfs, I would not be shocked to see Praetorians start showing up more in Necron lists because they're quite decent. Lichguard, of course, took a ton of nerfs going from the Index to the Codex, but one thing that was different from the way that GW often operates when they nerf the hell out of something is that Lichguard also got like a massive points cut. They went from 24 points a model down to 17. It's just like gigantic. Almost a third of their cost came off. And at 17 points per model, I mean, they're functionally same cost as like an Intercessor. They actually are pretty good. And I've used some myself, not with this particular detachment, but Lichguard are actually decent for their cost. Overlords, of course, are good, and one thing that can be taken from this ability and also these stratagems as we go through it, the Overlords that can, of course, join several different units who would then be Overlord keyworded. Problem there is, of course, what can they join? Necron warriors who are in a struggling space right now, especially offensively. Now you might think, well, +1 to wound would help. Maybe, but they're short range, strength 4 AP 0, 1 damage weapons with not even good ballistic skill. So maybe not. And then Immortals, who are genuinely a great unit and would benefit a lot from this, and that's probably something you want to lean into if you were to run this. But overall, like, opening up this keywording to include a little bit more would be nice, because there are several Necron special characters that would be pretty good, not just for this ability, but for some of the other stuff that we'll talk about here. There's also the use of the Catacomb Command Barge, which, like I said, it's a unit that's pretty close to being good. I think it's got a lot of play that just isn't being realized right now because it just never quite fits. But with, maybe a little boost from the detachment or two, suddenly it could be something you see on the table quite a bit with this detachment. The Silent King's kind of in the same boat. He probably could do with some points cuts, but his rules are genuinely good. So if you have something that synergizes a little bit better with him, you could see maybe some play from him. And then, of course, like the difficulty with Overlords, which are good, is that whilst you can use them to keyword, say, Immortals, so that they can benefit from all this stuff, Overlords themselves aren't necessarily cheap, so, your ability to do that 2 or 3 times in a given list might get a little bit more difficult. But yeah, so with this one, really, just more than anything, we need to mess a little bit with the keywords, and then it could have some play. Why can it have some play? Well, because beyond the +1 to wound ability, which, like I said, is a blanket thing, it's not tied to shooting or melee, it's both. There is a lot of other cool stuff in this detachment. For our enhancements, we again get something which I'm actually sure is unique in 40k right now, and is a super cool, if not frustrating, ability from one of the enhancements, which allows it so that every time the Overlord who has this enhancement kills an enemy character, your opponent actually loses 1 CP. Now, that is actually a frustrating ability. Some people probably would consider it toxic for the game because it's like land destruction in Magic. It sucks. But it is tactically a very interesting ability for especially an Overlord who can get somewhere and maybe pick up, a softer character or two. Again, I cannot mention the word Catacomb Command Barge enough. Then we get some other kind of nice little more minor buffs. There's an Unflinching Will. This gives an Overlord precision and also anti-infantry 5+, which may sound like a weird ability to give, especially since Overlords have pretty high strength values, so why do they need anti-infantry 5+? It's because they tend to have devastating wounds as well, so this helps them trigger their devastating wounds a little easier, which goes well with the precision ability. They have an ability, an enhancement to give -1 to hit in melee when their unit is targeted. It's fairly cheap, so it actually isn't bad. And then finally, they have a reroll hits ability when their unit targets, like when the Overlord's unit targets an enemy unit. Sorry there, had to run off for a minor cat emergency. Anybody who's got cats will know. Anyhow, an ability to reroll hits when the Overlord's unit is targeting an enemy unit that is on an objective. For stratagems, you've got a nice kind of mix of both offensive and defensive kind of stuff. Unfortunately, I would say that around 1 or 2 of them are kind of wasted on leadership shenanigans, which, as Chaos Knights and Tyranids to some extent have shown us, can be good, but you just need to have a lot of tools to mess with leadership and a lot of buffs, and this army doesn't do it. But it does get this one ability to, or stratagem to, when you kill your opponent's warlord, you can subtract 1 from your opponent's leadership for their battle shock test for the rest of the battle, which is great, I guess, if you want to lean into that. You don't get any other buffs towards battle shock or anything else, though. But they do have some good ones. They have a spectacular stratagem, one of the best in the entire book, actually. 1 CP to just give any Necrons unit, non-Titanic, which is very relevant, 5+ critical hits. There is a ton of units in Necrons who obviously love 5+ crits. This does specify non-Titanic because obviously one of those would be the Monolith, who would just absolutely pop off with 5+ criticals. Fortunately, you can't target the Monolith with it, but you do still have like a huge plethora of units that would love this. For 1 CP, shooting or fight phase, amazing stratagem. Then you also have a -1 damage ability, or stratagem, that you can target any of your vehicles with when they're targeted by an enemy unit. Lasts for literally the entire shooting or fight phase whenever they're targeted. Could be very handy for keeping certain units around. You have a 4+, similar to the Annihilation Legion, you have a 4+ fight on death ability. Only costs a single CP. Trick with this one, it is, again, keyworded quite limitedly. It's targeted to just Lich-Guard and Triarch Praetorians. Nonetheless, they probably would appreciate fight on death, so that is nice for them, even if the stratagem probably could be opened up a little bit. You have a 1 CP precision ability, which again can only be targeted to Lich-Guard or Triarch Praetorians, but again, both of those units are actually probably very happy to receive precision for those times where you are looking to carve some enemy unit or characters out of their units. And finally, you get actually a very handy objective control bonus stratagem, where you can add 1 to the OC of a unit of Lich-Guard or Praetorians. You could also target Triarch Stalker, in which case you actually get +3 OC. This is a very you use it in your command phase. This is a very handy ability for obviously being able to flip objectives. It's the type of thing that you're often looking for in armies that are slow but durable, which is exactly what this is. Like I said, the Obeisance Phalanx is a very interesting army, which, like, a little bit of changes could actually make it quite viable. I know myself, I would love to play this army. I might start playing this army a little bit just for the hell of it anyway. But with just, some subtle changes to the way that a few units are costed, or some of the keywords in here are presented, it could genuinely be something that you see kind of played in a meta sort of way at events and things. So we can hope for the best. Moving on, we do have 3 detachments in the Necron Codex that actually are doing quite well for themselves. We have the Canoptic Court, which I'm sure by now most people have even played against and probably hate already because wraiths are buggers to get rid of. We have the Hypercrypt, which of course is getting a lot of love post-LVO after Matt Laura had his great run with that, and is genuinely also a very strong and tricksy kind of army to play. And then we have the Awakened Dynasty, which win rate actually hasn't had like a massive renaissance since the arrival of the book, but actually does have a lot of strengths to it, and can be played in very similar ways to the Canoptic Court and have some success. And that's what we will talk about just in a little bit here once we've kind of covered the other ones. I am going to jump directly over to the Hypercrypt because it is kind of one of the lengthier detachments to look at, just for all of the myriad ways that it can be run with. Anybody who had the pleasure of playing against Grey Knights before the launch of the Necrons Codex already knows how powerful the detachment ability is. The ability to pick up to 3 units at the end of your opponent's turn and put them into strategic reserve, and then of course the rest of the detachment also having some things that enable you to make even better use of those units that are in strategic reserve. How you play with this army, I think, actually has almost infinite varieties to it. Laura himself, Matt Laura at LVO, did lean into what I would consider probably one of the more aggressive means of playing this army. But the monolith is kind of an auto take, but he played his monolith quite aggressively in a lot of games. He ran a bunch of immortals who are not really a unit that you try to camp around with. They play pretty offensively. A lot of people playing Hypercrypt are utilizing multiple Catan, who are obviously big pressure units, which get even nastier when they can be, redeployed all over the table, overcoming one of their only weaknesses, which is that they tend to move fairly slowly. But there are lots of other units which I haven't seen pop up quite yet in a lot of competitive Hypercrypt armies, but that are probably very good for them. Anything that has Deep Strike, obviously, is one of the obvious options, because that just gives you the ability to kind of bounce around a lot there. One unit that kind of comes to mind, even though it's ostensibly something that you might want to see more in Canoptic Court armies, is a couple of the Cryptex. I will talk about this a little bit more as we go along, but several of the Cryptex, namely the Plasmancer and the Psychomancer, actually have, in my mind, some play as a solo unit. Yes, they are fragile. There is no doubt about that. They're also quite cheap. We're talking like 55 points. And they have abilities which can be worth taking them just for their own sake. The Psychomancer, the ability to, for example, in a Hypercrypt, be able to drop him in your movement phase somewhere, and then be able to use his ability to hopefully battle shock unit, therefore preventing them from being able to use stratagems, could be a pretty big flip against certain armies. I actually like the Psychomancer even without the Hypercrypt, because I think if you plant him at the front of your deployment zone inside the corner of a building, he probably can reach a couple objectives, and then he can potentially be battle shocking enemy units the start of your command phase, thereby flipping you some primary points. But again, that's more of a generic thing. Plasmancer is very similar. We've already seen a couple armies run Grey Knight Librarians or Typhus, certain kind of mortal wound dealing characters solo. Obviously, a Plasmancer is way more fragile than they are, and he doesn't necessarily put out as many mortals either. However, he's a lot cheaper. 55 points, 4 dice, each 4-up's a mortal. This can actually be useful just for trying to pick up, little things or soften up little things on the board. I actually think he might work best in Hypercrypt, where he can be deployed, somewhere way at the back if need be, and then can use those mortals on a soft target somewhere, not to mention the fact that he also has a pretty good gun, which can then add some supplementary damage. He's got a tiny base, so you can actually fit these guys in all sorts of places. So that's kind of a thought pattern there. Anyhow, we're going to go over the enhancements and the stratagems just so that you guys can start thinking about your own things you might do with this. The enhancements are... none of them are necessarily come across as super sexy, but they all have pretty obvious applications within this army. There is one you can give to any Necron model, just gives the Bears unit Deep Strike. That is basically an auto take, obviously, to just be able to give a unit that doesn't have Deep Strike, which meshes well with the hyper phasing detachment rule. You have a Risen Tyrant, which allows a unit that has come in from reserve to reroll some hit rolls. I believe it's... oh, sorry, they always reroll hit rolls of 1. If they came in from reserve, it's all hit rolls. Again, full rerolls to hit is bonkers good, especially in Necrons, where there's lots of units with lethal or sustained hits who love that ability. You do have the Dimensional Overseer, which I actually have seen used more than I thought it would. It allows you to basically turn your 3 units a turn that you can pick up into 4. 4 feels like almost overkill in a lot of the games I've played, but at the same time, there are definitely people who are finding use for it. And again, maybe if you're actually going for an MSU style with more units to bounce around with, it can be very strong. It's also very cheap. And finally, you do have an ability to always have your unit, or enhancement to make it so the bearer and his unit always advance 6 inches. Again, quite handy, not terribly expensive. Definitely something that might find a place within the list. For stratagems, The kind of the joke of the stratagems section in the Hypercrypt is that basically 4 of them only apply to the monolith, which is a lot of stratagems for one unit. Technically speaking, only 2 of them actually keyword to the monolith. It's just that 2 more that it's pretty obvious that's what the target is. For those stratagems referring to the monolith, we do have Hypervasic Recall, which allows the monolith to, this is one of the 2 CP ones, monolith to pick up a unit after that unit has been attacked, shot, I think it's shot or fought. Yeah, shot or fought. Can pick up that unit and teleport it to the monolith. They have to be deployed within 6 inches. This is a very good ability, obviously, for just getting a unit out of a problematic spot and into hopefully a good one, especially if you're making good use of your monolith. I feel like the thing about this particular stratagem, and I've seen some other people mention it, it would have been really cool if this unit also reanimated when they did that. It would have been a neat way to kind of pull that old monolith ability to reanimate models back into the game. As it is, it's still a good ability. At 2 CP, you really do have to have a plan for it, though. That is kind of true of any army that's going to be playing with this kind of hyper-phasing type rule where you're bouncing up and down. It's a very cerebral army to play, so presumably you will have a plan, but definitely not something you just use for the sake of it. You also have another 2 CP stratagem, which specifically only affects the monolith, and that allows a unit that has been deployed out of the monolith's Eternity Gate ability to charge. Normally they're not allowed to, because functionally the unit that comes out of the monolith doesn't have to obey a lot of the rules that normally come up with units that just randomly show up on the table, like having to stay outside 9 inches. They can be deployed closer. Now, one of the rules then about the monolith's Eternity Gate ability is that they're not allowed to charge. This stratagem means that they can, so you can get a unit teleported in and making a very short charge into an enemy, which is awesome. That said, this is 2 CP for a good reason. It does obviously then very much limit the use of that ability. Nonetheless, it is good. Something to also note, the Monolith's Eternity Gate ability itself specifies that units that it teleport have to be Necron infantry, so you cannot use this kind of ability to, teleport a Nightbringer into somebody's face. But it can be used for Lich Guard, Praetorians, Scorpek Destroyers, obviously. There's a couple of units that you could have some fun with this with. 2 other stratagems, which again don't specifically mention the monolith, but are available here, are Quantum Deflection, which targets any Necron vehicle. It's 1 CP, and it just gives that vehicle a 4+ invulnerable for the phase after it's been targeted by an enemy, shooting or fighting. Most Necron vehicles have a 4+ invul. The monolith is one of the few that doesn't. That is why this is mostly a monolith-specific stratagem. Off the top of my head, I actually am struggling to think of another Necron vehicle that doesn't have a 4+ invul. Maybe the Triarch Stalker. We already have established that I don't really know much about that particular model because I hate it. But like Doomsday Arcs, Doomsday Stalkers, Annihilation Barges, Catacomb Command Barges, obviously, all have 4+ invuls. I guess a Ghost Arc, it would be another choice. Ghost Arcs don't have an invul, so that could be an option there. Or do they? They might have an invul. I haven't played with the Ghost Arc terribly often this particular edition. That's something that we can look up. But anyway, 4+ invul is pretty handy. The other stratagem that comes up, which is quite good, or hypothetically could be quite good, is the ability to spring hazardous on an enemy unit after they target one of your vehicles. I believe that this does have to target a Titanic unit. Yeah, one Titanic model from your army that was selected as the target of one or more attacking units, or one or more of the attacking unit's attacks and is within 18 inches. This ability costs 1 CB, and it makes all of the attacking units' guns hazardous. When this first got mentioned, I know there was quite a few people who immediately got sprung and were like, wow, there's going to be some units that can really suffer from this. The practical difficulty is that there's very few of those units that could be hurt badly by this are the type of units that are going to be going out of their way to shoot at a Titanic model. Yes, Terminators could have a really bad time if they're all shooting 4 shots into a monolith, and that monolith, suddenly makes all of their attacks hazardous, and oh my god. But like, Are they going to do that? Probably not. They weren't going to hurt the monolith anyway. And one of the only units that comes off as like something that throws a lot of dice that actually are scary to a monolith already has hazardous, and that is, of course, Crisis teams who are probably running triple cyclics. So this ability could be kind of cool. You can always keep your mind open if your opponent just decides to YOLO a ton of enemies attacks into, say, a monolith. It can be also targeting something like a Tesseract Vault if you're running something like that. But in practice, it's probably not going to have a lot of play, just because you're not going to get an enemy making a really dangerous play like that. I have double checked. The Ghost Ark does have a 4+ invul, so it is not a target for Quantum Deflection stratagem to get a 4+ invul, or it wouldn't be one. Like I said, it's mostly for the monolith. You could use it on the flyers. They don't have a 4+ invul, so if you've got a Doomsday Doomsday flyer that you really want to, put a 4+ invul on. Hilariously, I'm pretty sure you could also put it on a unit of Canoptic Spiders, who I believe are vehicles. And that would actually not be a bad spot. I don't know how many Canoptic Spiders you want to run in a Hypercrypt, but it is a target. Anyhow, you have the two more stratagems in this detachment, which are not locked to monoliths or vehicles even. One of them is Reanimation Crypts. That just allows units that have gone into Strategic Reserve to reanimate as normal, because obviously if you're in Strategic Reserve, you aren't deployed until the movement phase. Reanimation happens in the command phase. This ability is just there to kind of allow you to reanimate at all if that becomes relevant. It is 1 CP to affect all of your units in reanimate or in Strategic Reserve, so it occasionally will be useful. And then really the stratagem that pulls it all together, Cosmic Precision. This is just a generic stratagem that allows a unit that is either deep striking or hyper phasing, and therefore probably coming in off the side of the board as Strategic Reserve, to be deployed within 3 inches of an enemy unit, not 9. It does come with a standard caveat that you can't charge, but obviously this is incredibly important for an army that's putting units up and down every turn, to be able to maybe put 1 or 2 of those units in spots that you would not normally expect over the course of a game. Again, most famously, this has recently been used by Matt Laura in the LVO finals to put his monolith right in the middle of his opponent's deployment zone on the first turn. You may not always get that chance. When you do, maybe you take it. But there's plenty of uses, obviously, for a 3-inch deep strike stratagem. It's just a wildly good stratagem no matter what. And again, it's only 1 CP. Again, this army literally can be good with like probably more units in this codex than any other detachment. It is probably the most flexible detachment as far as your unit selection goes, because so much of its stuff is not specifically keyworded to certain types of units. Obviously, again, there is a bit of the meme about how most of its stratagems are keyworded to the monolith, or obviously best with the monolith. Thing about it is the monolith is very central to how this army wants to play anyway. So running a monolith, or who knows, maybe even more than 1 monolith, is something that you're kind of going to be doing if you're taking a Hypercrypt anyway. After that, you can really take units to your heart's content. There's so many good units that are good combos of units that you can put in here. Obviously, things like Immortals definitely come up. Units that have some native deep strike, like maybe Death Marks or Flayed Ones, haven't been played a ton, but actually I think could be quite good. I've even thought a little bit about maybe this is the rise of the Death Mark kind of army. The return of the Hex Mark maybe could probably see some play in the Hypercrypt as time goes on, and we see some changes to the Necron book. But anyhow, it is a very fun army. I would highly suggest that anybody who is getting into a Hypercrypt style Necron army is prepared to play 10+ games with it before you really make any calls about it, because it's the type of army that genuinely will test your thinking, test your strategic knowledge, and your opponents too, for that matter, and can be really great in that way. But it also means that sometimes you will have mistakes happen that make somebody, either you or your opponent, go, damn, I really did mess that up, didn't I? Which, is part of the fun of the game. But in any case, Hypercrypt has been doing quite well in the meta. I don't expect that to change anytime soon. I do think that it is one of the more flexible detachments you can take, so maybe have some fun with it. Moving on, we'll jump into Canoptic Court. Canoptic Court, I assume, is the one that most people are going to understand the most, because it is probably the most, well, it's easily the most played Necron detachment so far. It's also, I think, still has the highest win rate, although it's not necessarily way ahead of Hypercrypt. The Canoptic Court is definitely not quite as cerebral of an army. In fact, I've referred to it as an Unga Bunga army before. It is very much a push stuff into your opponent's face and make them deal with it kind of army. With that said, in its current form, it is very successful at doing that. The detachment rule, the power matrix, functions again very similar to the Chaos Daemon's Shadow of Chaos rule, where you're just trying to hold objectives within, no man's land or your opponent's deployment zone. Your own deployment zone is always considered to be part of your power matrix. Being in your power matrix enables both full rerolls to hit for Canoptic and Cryptek units, but it also is relevant for some of their other abilities that pop up in the detachment. The army is relatively heavy on OC. Wraiths are 2 OC, Immortals, who are very commonly used, are 2 OC, Tomb Blades are 2 OC, and a lot of the kind of other mid-range stuff has decent OC. Doomstalkers are funny, they're 4 OC, despite a lot of similar vehicles usually being 3. And all of that extra OC that this army holds is very relevant to how it works with the power matrix, because you do need to be holding, in most games, 2/3 of no man's land to actually be getting much of your power matrix. A couple of your units like Doomstalkers probably hang out in your deployment zone to get their power matrix anyway, but a lot of your other units will be pushing forward and do need to be holding onto those central objectives to make the power matrix really worth it. As far as the enhancements goes, we've got a couple of kind of auto takes almost. There is one, the Dimensional Sanctum, which gives a Cryptek and the Squatty Joins Infiltrate. This, of course, gets attached to Wraiths pretty much all the time. Having an infiltrating squad as durable as Wraiths are is a wicked good boon for any army. And then also the Auto Divinator, which is an ability very much like Kodiaz, I believe, is the Inquisitor, where if your opponent gains a CP through an ability, you roll a die, on a 2-up, you get a CP as well. This army is pretty CP hungry. The Auto Divinator is a good way to get those CPs in certain matchups, like if you're playing against Eldar or Dark Angels or Guard, or someone who is genuinely going to be popping up an extra CP all the time. Orcs are another pretty good one. But obviously there are lots of matchups where your opponent's not generating extra CP, and then it doesn't really help you out. To that extent, Emotech the Stormlord is not just in Canoptic Court, but in actually quite a few Necron armies, pretty common, because he generates a CP in each of your command phases. He's definitely an option to look into. There are 2 other enhancements in here which are less heralded for the Canoptic Court. The Metallodermal Tesla Weave, which potentially causes some mortal wounds to enemies that charge the bearer's unit, and the Hyperphasic Fulcrum, which gives reroll 1s to wound to the bearer and their unit as long as they are within their power field, which is actually a pretty good ability, but it does really tie into, again, you have to be able to hold power field probably in the middle of the board if you want to get use out of it. As far as stratagems go, we'll run through these real quick because I'm sure most of you have been subjected to them already. Probably the biggest one, which went from very much hero to zero, is Cynosure of Eradication, which is the devastating wound stratagem. Could be used in both shooting and melee. Allows the unit that is targeted by it to just gain devastating wounds for their attacks for that phase. It is 2 CP. It was obviously very, very strong in immortal units with a boatload of attacks, and a Overlord who could make the stratagem free. This was a very strong combination, but it is now gone, as the stratagem was reworded to specify that only Cryptek and Canoptic models, not units, can benefit from it. As it is, like, you're never going to pay 2 CP to get devastating wounds on any Cryptek or Canoptic models. I shouldn't say never. Like, it could happen, but it's too much. Wraiths are probably the best target for that ability at this point. You'd have to be pretty desperate. It would have to be a very specific situation. Most of the time, you're not going to use that, which is too bad. But they do have lots of other good stratagems. Of course, the two big ones, which can only target canoptic units, not cryptics, only canoptic units, but nonetheless are great, are the counter-temporal shift, which turns the cryptic or a canoptic unit that you target into a lone op for the remainder of a phase. Very strong. And also the reactive subroutines, which allows a canoptic unit to make a normal move. Normal move up to 6 inches after an enemy unit ends a normal advance or fallback move within 9 inches of that canoptic unit. That kind of redeploy movement is used extensively in a few other armies in the game. Of course, most notably Eldar with Phantasm, who don't actually have that many riders on usage of Phantasm, but certainly also Vanguard Space Marines and Vanguard NIDs. No, not Vanguard NIDs. One of the other NID detachments has a similar ability. Very strong, obviously. Again, both of these are most often going to be used on Wraiths, maybe lone-opping some Doomstalkers to keep them safe within your deployment zone. But they're both very powerful. This detachment's reanimation stratagem is just a free, or not a free, a reanimation when you are targeted by a charge. Costs 1 CP. Again, not as good as, say, like the Awakened Dynasties, but this is probably one of the better reanimation stratagems. There is quite a few times where you are being charged and you would like a reanimate. So this is a good spot for it. And then finally, you got two kind of funkier stratagems. You got the Solar Pulse for 1 CP. This just strips cover from every enemy unit on a given objective that is within 18 inches of a cryptek. The ability to strip cover is very strong. This particular army doesn't necessarily benefit from it as much as some do, but there are some worlds where, like, especially if you are using a lot of Immortals, maybe you're comboing off with Illuminor Caesaris to buff your Immortals, that then the ability to strip cover off of, some medium to high armor save units could really be quite good. And finally, you have Curse of the Cryptek, which is a 1 CP ability that when a Cryptek is destroyed, you can then get a game-long +1 to hit and wound versus the unit which destroyed the Cryptek. This is extremely powerful because +1 to hit and +1 to wound are bonkers. Obviously, that on Race is great. The +1 to hit is spectacular on the Doomstalkers. +1 to wound, maybe not as much, but giving all your Canoptic units +1 to hit and wound is a really nice buff. Obviously, it is tied to a Cryptek of yours dying, but there is a lot of situations where this is worth spending for. You look at Leagues of Votann, the army basically functions because of +1 to hit and wound tokens. This is a judgment token, multiple judgment tokens, actually. And the reality is that your opponent is going to be going out of their way to get rid of your Crypteks. So here you go. In fact, it may even be a good reason to run a few solo Crypteks that are even easier to kill. Just saying. That's your whole suite of stratagems. Like I kind of mentioned a little bit in some of the other earlier detachments, I think that there is definitely room for running solo Crypteks, specifically Psychomancers and Plasmancers, in some armies. Certainly Technomancers make they're core to this particular army. To use them with Wraith. You are probably going to be using Plasmancers with some Immortals as well in this army. Doomstalkers are spectacular. I have had my eye a little bit on Canoptic Spiders in this army. Specifically, their shooting actually becomes reasonable with the buffs that you can get here. I think Spiders are still in a spot where they're a little bit too expensive to be running, but that doesn't mean that they don't have a place. They also could be, nice for some support for a couple of your units, depending on what your matchups are. Certainly some of the Forge World models have been getting some play here as well. Canoptic Acanthrites are mediocre for what they actually accomplish, but again, they are fairly fast. They have some deployment abilities, I believe, specifically. I can't remember if they're scouts or infiltrators, but they're one of the two. This is a Canoptic unit that can actually get a little bit of work done. They do have Meltaguns. Rerolls to hit on Meltaguns is pretty good. So they have some play, as well as one of the big centipede monsters. I want to say it is the Stalker. I think might be this. No, it's probably the Sentinel. The Tomb Sentinel, I believe, is the stronger one with this particular setup. Either way, Also very good units to run with this kind of stuff. The Canoptic Court definitely does push you towards the Canoptic units and the Cryptex very, very strongly. You will not get a lot of love out of units that cannot benefit from one of those keywords, just because of how this particular detachment is laid out. But unlike the Annihilation Legion that we talked about earlier, the buffs we get here are relevant enough and widely spaced enough to benefit both some melee and some shooting units that the army is quite potent. And of course, the strength, like just the base strength of the Wraith datasheet really helps make this army tick. I would also argue the base strength of the Immortal datasheet helps a lot, but Immortals are good in like basically every detachment. So anyhow, you'll have lots and lots of Canoptic Courts to deal with for the next 3 months, I'm sure. As with always, one thing I will throw out there for everybody who is struggling with Canoptic Courts is anything you can do to kill the Technomancers is worth it. I am not just saying that so that your opponent can then get +1 to hit and wound you with that stratagem, which I think is very strong. It is a reality that the army very much lives and dies by its Technomancers and its Plasmancers and whatnot. So getting rid of them is great. Precision's awesome. A lot of them are not that hard to kill, so if you can focus on that, it'll go a long way towards evening things up. The other thing, of course, with Power Matrix, and this is true also of Daemons, with the Shadow of Chaos, is if you can just keep them from getting their Power Matrix active within No Man's Land, you will already be well on your way to success, because removing full rerolls to hit is a massive nerf to the whole army. So if you kind of are thinking about that as you're going into those Canoptic Court games, hopefully you'll have a little bit more success. Finally, before we finish off for today, I do want to talk a bit about the Awakened Dynasty. The Awakened Dynasty has been very interesting to me in the last few weeks, because I was looking at it as a bit of an alternative to the Canoptic Court, when the Canoptic Court ostensibly and inevitably gets nerfed. I think that Awakened Dynasty still has a lot of play. It is still one of the detachments, much like Hypercrypt, that can run a whole lot of different units successfully. It's probably, I hate to say it, the best attachment to still run destroyers in, which is sad because there's a destroyer attachment, but whatever. But I also think that there are Canoptic Court armies or very similar armies that are very similar to a Canoptic Court army that can have a lot of success in Awakened Dynasty as well, with some changes. To cover it off as a review pretty quickly here, because Awakened Dynasty has been around since the start of 10th. Its primary detachment benefit is just any unit that has a character attached gets +1 to hit. Its primary enhancements that you're going to be looking at are the Veil of Darkness, which allows a unit to make a once per game basically redeploy. You pick the unit up at the end of your opponent's turn, plop it back down with Deep Strike at the end of your next movement phase. The Netherrealm Casket, which just basically gives a unit stealth, like the attached unit stealth, and then a 4+ Feel No Pain for one character that you can hand out for fairly cheap. It does have one more enhancement, the Phasal Subjugator. This used to be quite a bit stronger. Right now it's decent. It basically makes it so that you give it to a character, and then any Necron unit within 6 inches of that character gets a +1 to hit. That is on its own a very strong buff. The reason why it's not that great here is because the army ability is +1 to hit, and you cannot stack those +1 to hits, so you oftentimes will not necessarily be getting a lot of use out of that second +1 to hit. This used to make the units in the aura count as having a character attached, which is relevant to a lot of the stratagems I'm about to go through. It no longer does that, which is unfortunate. The stratagems are quite good as well. There's not a whole lot of duds in here. There is a Protocol of the Eternal Revenant. This is the stand your character back up stratagem. This is bonkers good. It is 1 CP. It just automatically stands a character back up with half their HP. You can only use it on each character once per battle, but it is a spectacular ability to have in your back pocket, especially for example, some of those Cryptex that I'm telling you to run solo, which maybe can then be a little bit more durable because it actually takes 2 activations to kill them, not 1. It's also basically an auto take if you're running Illuminor Cesaris, who is an absolute monster to kill in the first place, and then they stand right back up with half their wounds. Very handy. Not to mention numerous other possible uses. Protocol of the Undying Legions, again, 1 CP. This is the best reanimation stratagem in the whole book. You just use it after an opponent is done attacking you, either in the shooting or melee phase. And it also gives you D3 plus 1, basically an extra plus 1 wound, if a character is attached to the unit that you use it on. So 2 very strong defensive stratagems right off the hop. You then get some pretty good offensive stratagems. You have Protocol of the Hungry Void, which is a melee-focused stratagem, which gives a unit plus 1 strength and also plus 1 AP if they have a character attached for a fight phase. You have the Protocol of the Conquering Tyrant, which is a shooting stratagem. Gives you reroll 1s to hit while shooting. Reroll all hits while shooting if a character is attached. This does only work when you're targeting a unit within half of your unit's range, so it is not necessarily like a blanket easy access reroll all hits, but it definitely has play because reroll all hits is really good, so you're hopefully planning to use that. Protocol of the Sudden Storm, which is a very, very nice ability to help you with scoring some things. It gives the unit that you target assault on all of their weapons, which is obviously relevant for offensive purposes as well, but like also helps you score a lot of secondaries in the game. It also lets you reroll the unit's advance roll if a character is attached to them. And then finally, probably the one bad strat that is in here is 2 CP for the Protocol of the Vengeful Stars. This is one of those shoot back stratagems, but it is much worse than pretty much all the other ones. This one, you target a Necron character with it. When a Necron unit within 6 inches of that character dies, and then that character can shoot back at the unit that killed your Necron unit. Problem here is, like, there's numerous problems. 1, this is 2 CP, which is bonkers. 2, very few Necron characters have good shooting. Certainly not shooting that you would pay 2 CP for to shoot back at an enemy unit. Furthermore, as with many of the shooting or shoot back stratagems, you can only target the unit that did shoot and kill your Necron unit. You don't want to be losing Necron units in the first place, but whatever, that has happened. So you need to have a Necron character with good shooting that's actually good into the target that you have to attack, and then you have to spend 2 CP. Not a good stratagem. But the other 5 are pretty good. My theory crafting on this in regards to its usage with Canoptic Court style armies in specific is that you trade out a couple of kind of tricks and a couple of defensive abilities for other tricks and defensive abilities here, but you also get an opportunity to run a little bit wider of a variety of units with Awakened Dynasty as compared to Canoptic Court. So, for example, in an Awakened Dynasty, you could still run 12 plus race, and they're still actually quite good, because they're going to have their Technomancers giving them +1 to hit, which means that they actually are hitting on a comparable rate, actually better than rerolling 1s to hit. Not as good as rerolling all hits, but still decently. Furthermore, those Technomancers are harder to get rid of, because you have the ability to stand characters back up, so race will be able to keep their Technomancers around for a lot longer. They also have a better reanimation stratagem for those race. So your race are loving it. Furthermore, Protocol of the Hungry Void that gives +1 strength and AP is actually very good on race. One of race's primary weaknesses is a lack of AP. So being able to get them to strength 7 and AP 2 actually starts to make them a little bit better in combat. Something that actually can get some work done. So race just love these abilities. Your Immortals will still be able to presumably have a good time. They don't get quite as easy access to reroll hits as the Power Matrix would give, but they can get them off the Protocol of the Conquering Tyrant. The Veil of Darkness works very well with both Race and Immortals. Whoever you might want to staple it to, it's just a wicked good ability no matter what. And then, of course, you might see like Doomstalkers fall kind of to the wayside because they don't necessarily jive with Awakened Dynasty so much, but you do have units like Locust Destroyers, Locust Heavy Destroyers, Doomsday Arcs, a variety of wicked good shooting units that don't necessarily have a place in Canoptic Court because Doomstalkers are better there, but these other units can have buffs from Awakened Dynasty. So, I don't know. it's something I've been playing around a little bit with. I don't know that it's necessarily better. You do, of course, lose the lone op stratagem. You also lose the reactive move stratagem that you can use on your race. Both of those are not small losses. They are genuine things that you probably will at some point wish you have. But there are also times where you wish you could stand your Technomancer back up. So the Awakened Dynasty definitely has some play there. The Awakened Dynasty also almost certainly has play outside of like a Canoptic Court style army. It's not being experimented with a lot right now. Part of that just comes, and I think we'll see this with lots of codexes, where this is the old strata or the old detachment. As long as there are other kind of cooler, shinier, newer things to play with, people will play with those. But I do think that kind of with the Gladius in the Space Marine book and the Invasion Fleet in the Tyranid book, we will see over the next month or two a little bit of a drawback to the Awakened Dynasty as people start to realize that maybe there is still quite a bit of play in this particular detachment. So keep your eyes out for it. And again, especially if we do get some more nerfs to Necrons in the next little while, because I don't think that they'll be targeting this particular detachment terribly much. They'll be targeting the Canoptic Court and they'll be targeting the Hypercrypt Legion. So that is your 5 Necron detachments and kind of where they are and what you can expect from them. What we have seen from them for the last 2 months or so, and what hopefully we will see more of over the next couple months. Again, it's actually like one of probably the better books in the sense that like there are 4 detachments that are right there in the usability kind of spot. The Obeisance Phalanx is maybe not there, but like I really do feel like it's pretty close. I would love to see a few little changes to it, and it would very much be something that could be on a lot of tables. But both Hypercrypt and Canoptic are having lots of success, and they are very different armies, so that's great for the playability of the book. And then the Awakened Dynasty also is there, and like I said, I think it will become more popular over the next month or so. Hashtag pray for Annihilation Legion, I guess. We'll see how that shakes out. As it is right now, though, Necrons are obviously a meta army to play. There's a lot of folks, especially in light of the changes on the data slate, who feel like they are probably the meta army to play and to watch out for if you are not playing them. Again, how exactly you counter them is going to depend a little bit on what the opponent is playing. Canoptic Court is very much a different beast than Hypercrypt. Like with Canoptic Court, winning mostly revolves around what you can do to limit the race. Whether that doesn't necessarily mean getting rid of them, which is very hard to do, but being able to pull objectives back from them, being able to stop them up and hold them up in places where they're not going to cause you as much trouble as they'd like. With the Hypercrypt, it's a completely different kind of game. You really just have to have excellent target priority and be constantly aware of which units are actually going to be the most dangerous to you. The Monolith is an obvious pick. They're not simple to get rid of, but they are one that you can obviously focus on pretty comfortably. But after that, like the units that are going to matter in the game aren't always obvious. Mortals are easy to spot and say, oh, well, those have lots of OC and are more offensive than most Necron units, but sometimes they aren't the thing you got to worry about when you're playing Hypercrypt. It's really, you just have to be very, very focused on your movement, blocking things out, and making sure that you are keeping yourself from getting flanked in ways that you don't expect, which is not easy to do. That's, again, part of why Grey Knights actually have had quite a bit of play in a meta, despite having a lot of data sheets that could use some love. It's because of the strength of their detachment that is similar to Hypercrypt. So, I don't know. We'll see how that kind of shakes out over the next few months. I would expect they'll get some nerfs on Hypercrypt as well. In the meantime, hopefully I have inspired you to play some other stuff as well, not just Canoptic Court and Hypercrypt. Or if you are, to maybe experiment with some new things. Let's see 6 spiders in Canoptic Court. Let's see somebody busting out a bunch of destroyers or something like that in Hypercrypt. Let's see some people playing some Awakened Dynasty again, maybe with some reinvigorated units. Let's see a lot of people writing constant emails to GW to make some small changes to the Obeisance Phalanx so that I can play with the Silent King model. All of those things would be great. So in any case, thank you for swinging by for our Necrons Codex review. Trident does have a few events coming up over the next few months. I'm not sure how much we're allowed to talk about some of the stuff we've got for later in the summer just yet, but if you are interested, I know we will be hosting both Adepticant in March. Just a one day little RTT. I do believe it is already full, but of course contact us if you want to go onto the wait list for that. And then in April, we will be doing both another Age of Sigmar RTT, and I think we might be eyeballing something else for the end of April, but we haven't really decided yet. Then in May, we have our Teams tournament. As of the time that this video goes live, that is not yet full, but it's getting pretty close. There's lots of room on Teams, but there's only room for 8 teams. So take a look at that if you're interested. If you see that there's already 8 teams there, maybe get in contact with one of the captains and say, hey, do you got a spot on your team still? There are 4 people per team. That's going to be an absolute blast of a 2-day event, May 25th and 26th, that you guys can come hang out with us. So hopefully we'll see you there over the next couple months, maybe with Necrons. And we will be back for the Codex Adeptus Mechanicus Codex review pretty soon here, again with a special guest. I am very excited to go over them, even as I am not at all excited about what GW keeps doing to my fucking Skitarii. Anyhow, thanks for coming in to hang out with me, and we will see you guys next time.
Did you plug the Patreon? We need to plug the Patreon.